So we want to welcome everybody to this webinar. This is another webinar in our Animal Law and Science Project series, which is a project of the Animal Legal Education Initiative at the George Washington Law School and the Camilla Center for Animal Advocacy. We're going to have a second webinar addressing this topic of scientific declarations, and that will take place on November 18th at noon Eastern, and that will focus a little more on the legal side of things. This webinar will focus on the scientific side. So this webinar, Scientific Declarations on Animal Capacities, we're getting to hear from this great panel of experts. We have Jennifer Duquette from the University of Miami, Jonathan Birch from the London School of Economics, and Lori Marino from the Camilla Center for Animal Advocacy, the Whale Sanctuary, and NYU. Their bios are on the event page, so you can learn more about them. Today's session will consider the purpose and impact of scientific declarations from our leading scientists and others who have experience working with and creating declarations and statements and working with legal advocates and aesthetics. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the GW Animal Law YouTube page, and you can find recordings from our past events there as well. So now I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and we'll begin with Lori Marino. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will have a Q&A after we all give a presentation. So we look forward to your questions, which you can put in the Q&A. So I'm going to share my screen. And hope that you can see that title slide. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you all the panelists and Kathy. About 14 years ago, I took a trip to Helsinki, Finland. I was invited to participate in a group exercise by Chris Butler Stroud of WDC Whale and Dolphin Conservation, and we wanted to put together a framework for the kinds of rights that we feel cetaceans, dolphins, and whales should have. So we had a conference at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies at the University of Helsinki, and we all felt that, one, the science was in. In other words, we don't know everything about all cetaceans, but we certainly know enough to have a sense of the kinds of beings that they are. And we also knew that things were not going so well, not as well as we'd like. They're currently being treated as resources to be harvested. So even today, the drive hunts are going on. They're taken from the ocean to be put into entertainment parks. And our sense was that international law manifests a growing duty to whales and dolphins. Contemporary ethical reflection brings new tools to bear on their moral status. And scientific research gives us insights into how complex their minds are. So we were brought together as scholars from a number of relevant disciplines to try to spell out the implications of what we know about cetaceans. And these were the people who made up the conference group. Chris Butler Stroud from Whale and Dolphin Conservation Society, Thomas White, who wrote the wonderful book In Defense of Dolphins, is an ethicist. Hal Whitehead at Dalhousie, who is an expert in cetacean culture. Myself, Nicholas Entrup, who has been studying cetaceans. Paolo Cavalieri, who is involved in efforts for rights for primates. So, and several other individuals, all involved in either ethics or science or some relevant area where we could come together and articulate what we would like the world to be like for cetaceans. And after several days of giving presentations and talking, we came up with what's now known as the Declaration of Rights for Cetaceans. It is based on the principle of equal treatment of all persons. So all of us there see cetaceans as non-human persons. And so the equal treatment paradigm is the one that we feel and felt was important as a framework for this declaration. We recognize the scientific research, and we are also noted that international law was starting to progress, not as much as we'd like, but it was starting. And so our declaration had 10 parts. 1, every individual cetacean has the right to life. 2, no cetacean should be held in captivity or servitude, or be subject to cruel treatment or removed from their natural habitat. 3, all cetaceans have the right to freedom of movement and residence in their natural habitat. 4, no cetacean is the property of any state or corporation or even an individual. 5, cetaceans have the right to the protection of their natural environment. That's something that we discussed quite a bit. 6, cetaceans have the right not to be subject to the disruption of their cultures, something that you can put an exclamation point on. 7, these rights, freedoms, and norms should be protected under both international and domestic law. 8, cetaceans are entitled to an international order in which these rights can be realized. 9, no state, human, or corporation can engage in an activity that undermines these rights. And 10, nothing in this declaration prevents a state from enacting even stricter protections for cetaceans. So what we went big here, we decided, we would like to articulate an international law that allows cetaceans to live on the planet without being disrupted by our species. And we presented a lot of the scientific findings as the basis for this declaration. The fact that cetaceans have enormously complex social behaviors and they're cognitively very complex. I presented on their large and complex brains. Consciousness came into the issue as there's a conscious beings. Emotion also figured into our discussions, and social complexity and culture. And that's why we included the cultural component, because we knew that the social complexity and culture part was extremely important to cetaceans. And through how whiteheads work and others, we had a lot of evidence showing that these guys, different cetacean species, are cultural beings. So what are the characteristics of this declaration? Well, just a few that I want to point out. 1, these are substantive rights. We did not get into procedural rights. We really intended for this to have an international scope. It's based upon the right to life, liberty, and well-being, and equal treatment for all persons. So this really does put cetaceans on an equal footing with humans and request equal treatment. Recognizes each cetacean as an individual person, because the fact is that traditional conservation methods don't recognize individual cetaceans, but we wanted to make sure that that was clear, that individuals are important and should be respected. It recognizes the need to respect cetacean cultures. This is unusual, but relevant, because we know now many non-human animals have cultures. It recognizes the right to protect natural habitat. That was something we discussed for a long time, because we was thinking, could we really extend things to that point where we can say we have to preserve the ocean in which they live in? And again, it sets forth minimal, not top, but minimal standards that any nation is welcome to exceed. So we wrote that declaration and we posted it online, and we invited several scientists and advocates and ethicists and philosophers to come and sign on to the declaration. Then a couple of years later, Thomas White and I conducted a panel discussion at the annual meeting for the Advancing AAAS, in which we talked about the ethical and policy implications of intelligence in cetaceans. Chris Butler Stroud was also part of that. And needless to say, people found it very exciting, but there were a lot of people that were not happy about us presenting this at AAAS. So to date, this declaration for cetacean rights has not yet been incorporated into international law. It sits on the website, but it doesn't have any teeth. And so I really want to think about next steps. What is it that we can do to start to move into the realm of actually enacting some of these components? Can it be recognizing cetaceans as legal persons, create legislation, protect cetaceans under international law? That's a tall order, and enact stricter provisions. And since then, there has been some progress. In Canada in 2019, they passed Bill S-203, which is not a rights-based bill. There are no rights-based bills for cetaceans, but it does ban breeding and keeping them in Canada for entertainment. And in the United States, we have the SWIMS Act, which does something very similar. And it started with the Non-Human Rights Project, the late Steve Wise. And it's making its way, but it's got a long road to hoe. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what we did in Helsinki. And here we are, 14 years later. And I wish that there was something we could do that actually gave our efforts some way to get on the ground and do the work of protecting cetaceans. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. And now Jonathan will use his slides. That was great. While he's doing that, I'll answer one of the questions, which is, will these materials be available? And yes, the recordings will be available on the YouTube channel, and I'll see if I can put that in the chat. Thanks, Jonathan. They look great. Are on mute.
Okay, thanks very much for organizing this, Kathy, and thanks for everyone who's attending. I'm going to focus on a declaration that I was involved in organizing in April of this year, called the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. If you want to see the declaration and the list of 480 signatories, just go to nydeclaration.com. I was really surprised that URL hadn't been taken by anyone, but apparently it hadn't, and we got it. And now nydeclaration.com is us. So why did we want to do a declaration at all? It was me and Kristen Andrews and Jeff Sebo primarily who were talking about this, and thought the last 10 years have seen exciting progress in the science of animal minds. The webpage gives 10 highlights, but there's many, many more examples as well. Things like, cuttlefish showing signs of future planning and delayed gratification, octopuses valuing pain relief when they're injured, crabs weighing up competing motivations, bees appearing to play, fishes passing the famous mirror test, specifically cleaner wrasse, and fruit flies displaying extraordinary phenomena like not just having sleep, but having active and quiet phases of sleep that resemble the difference between REM sleep and slow wave sleep in us. Among many other examples, some of them behavioral, some of them neuroscientific. And these advances, they're saying something. They're giving us a new picture of the likely place of consciousness in nature and the way humans relate to other animals. Because we think that even though this research is often done under the heading of animal cognition or animal behavior or neuroscience, research done under those headings is providing evidence relevant to questions of consciousness. It's showing that we're not alone in having subjective experiences, feelings, emotions, states like pain and pleasure. And it's not just that we're not alone, but that versions of these states are shared with a very, very wide range of animals, quite possibly, although not certainly by any means, including many invertebrate animals, as well as vertebrates. We felt that, well, this is how it looks from inside this emerging area of animal sentience research or animal consciousness research. But that isn't necessarily visible from the outside to people in other areas of science, to the general public, to lawmakers, to policymakers. And so we wanted to try and send a message that would get through to them, a message that says animal consciousness is a serious topic of scientific inquiry with a bright future. And so we assembled a group of 40 initial signatories to agree a text. And we wanted it to be short and simple and easy to quote and accessible. And hopefully the text does deliver on all of those things, because it just says this: which animals have the capacity for conscious experience? While much uncertainty remains, some points of wide agreement have emerged. First, there is strong scientific support for attributions of conscious experience to other mammals and to birds. Second, the empirical evidence indicates at least a realistic possibility of conscious experience in all vertebrates, including all reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, and many invertebrates, including at minimum cephalopod mollusks, decapod crustaceans, and insects. Third, when there's a realistic possibility of conscious experience in an animal, it's irresponsible to ignore that possibility in decisions affecting that animal. We should consider welfare risks and use the evidence to inform our responses to these risks. Almost all the key terms in this are negotiated, and they reflect elements of compromise among the 40 initial signatories. And so in some ways, the language is quite conservative, cautious, moderate, because that's how you find points of agreement. You don't go beyond what people can agree to. And that's what we were aiming to do here in building a broad coalition. And so although these claims are quite cautious, they do the job that we wanted them to do, which is show this emerging new picture that is really quite substantial and significant in its implications, because in lots of animal taxa where welfare has traditionally not been discussed and it's been ignored, and the animals are treated as though they had no welfare interests at all, we're saying that has to change in light of this evidence. And then there's lots of opinions about how it should change, and that's normal. So we say at least a realistic possibility, because the evidence does not allow us to speak of certainty, proof, or even conclusive evidence. When we're looking at the evidence from insects, for example, it's very heavily focused on a small number of species, particularly bees and Drosophila fruit flies. And so one is talking about, well, what is a realistic possibility given this evidence that contains lots of gaps? And so it'd be inappropriate to exaggerate our certainty in these cases, but we can speak of markers or indicators, signs, symptoms, behaviors or brain processes that raise the probability of consciousness and challenge a view of these animals as simple reflex machines that have nothing more complex or interesting or centralized than our own reflexes. Think here about the human case. I mean, what is it that convinces you that other humans are conscious beings? Well, there's linguistic evidence. We talk about our feelings. But it's implausible to think that it's only linguistic evidence that is relevant to these questions. I mean, if that were true, we'd probably be equally sure that ChatGPT was conscious. It's really not only linguistic evidence. It's the fact that that linguistic evidence is coherent with a huge amount of non-verbal behavior, where when people express their emotions through body language, through facial expressions, through their decision-making, through learning, innumerable markers. And the neural evidence is also coherent with that too, that in no case have we found drastic differences between human brains to make it in any way plausible that consciousness is there in some of them, but not others, except in cases of serious brain injury, where there's sometimes genuine debate.
Mm-hmm.
We use the method of inference to the best explanation in the human case, this philosophical label for the principle that I think is ubiquitous in science generally, that when you have this diverse set of markers and you're thinking of explanations for them, you're entitled to take those markers as evidence of the best explanation. And in the human case, it's quite clear that the best explanation for all those markers is that you are conscious. It's not plausible to think there's some giant conspiracy where people are going around faking all of these markers when actually they're zombies. Of course, explanations like that based on superficial mimicry are far more plausible in the case of AI. And that method of inference to the best explanation that we use with other humans, we just extend that to other animals too. And so we can talk about these markers as raising the probability of consciousness when they're well explained by conscious states like pain, pleasure, anxiety, joy, and so on. Even though the raising of the probability doesn't mean we know them with certainty. We think that where we are with mammals and birds, of course, this is one of the key things we were discussing. How strong are the different kinds of evidence here? That the language of strong scientific support is appropriate because it's not certainty, but you do have many, many lines of evidence all pointing in the same direction. With fishes and with cephalopods, decapods, insects, we decided it was more appropriate to use this language of at least a realistic possibility, which allows that if your own reading of the evidence is enough to support high probability in terms of your own degrees of belief, then fair enough. And I'm certainly one of those people who thinks that insects are really more likely than not to be conscious in some sense. But everyone can agree on this language of, at the very least, a realistic possibility, where what we meant by that, well, not going to put a precise number on it, because if you ask people to give their precise degree of belief in whether a bee is conscious, for example, you just see wide variation, and you wouldn't be able to agree on a declaration that said 38% chance or 25% chance. So what we have is this language of realistic possibility, where what everyone does agree on among our signatories is that the probability is high enough to warrant both further scientific investigation as a matter of priority and careful consideration of welfare risks. What's the goal of a declaration like this then? One of the goals is scientific. So we think a new field of animal consciousness research is emerging, quite an exciting interdisciplinary field that blends disciplines in ways we haven't seen before, that is bringing together people from neuroscience, comparative psychology, from my own discipline of philosophy, evolutionary biology, the behavioral sciences, law, animal welfare, and veterinary science, around a shared agenda and a shared set of questions. But of course, it's very difficult to really get a field like this off the ground, and it needs support, the support of universities, governments, funders. It's not received a lot of that support so far. It's often been viewed with skepticism that in my mind is part of the legacy of behaviorism, particularly in the US. And so what we wanted to do, launching this direct declaration in the US, in New York, was make this statement that might catch the eye of funders and universities, and do some, bolster the scientific seriousness of this emerging field. It's a declaration that says this emerging field is making progress, generating high quality work that is changing the way we think about other animals. There's also an ethical policy related aim as well, because we were juggling these two aims in our discussions about the wording, because it was also very important to us to say this emerging field is not just pure science for its own sake with no interest in the rest of the world. It's rather science that matters. This emerging field in particular matters for animal welfare. It matters for designing policies, laws, ways of caring for animals. And that certainty about consciousness should not be required for consideration of welfare risks. And then in cases where we're not certain, like insects, we can still have that discussion about, well, what risks do they face, for example, from insect farming, where they might be put into shredders, blast dried to death and so on, starved to death. What are the welfare concerns and what can be done to address them? And the evidence that we have now can already inform our approach to welfare issues. Beyond that, I mean, there's no reason to think that our 480 signatories agree on particular policy measures. Of course not. You always get disagreement about specific policies. Some people thinking food systems need to change very radically to protect the interests of animals. Others thinking maybe much less radical forms of change would be enough. Some people thinking that, well, maybe in the case of insects, there's very little we can do. And so our ability to help them is very limited. All of that is compatible with the text because we wanted something that a broad coalition of people could agree to. But I think it's very significant that even these very general ideas, they've long been seen as marginal ideas defended by small numbers of people. And this is no longer true, really. That what this declaration is showing us is that there's a genuine community of 480 experts. And if you, by the way, if you're watching this and you do have relevant expertise and you do want to sign, you still can, because we certainly would not mind getting to 500. But 480 experts with relevant expertise, including many world-leading experts, agree with those general ideas, and we thought that was an important message to send. And indeed, it was very, very widely covered, including NBC in America, the BBC in the UK, and many other places as well. And so I'm hoping that message has got out to the general public by this route. So that was what we were trying to do. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And now we hear from Jennifer.
Start number 2. Thank you all for being here today, and I will be talking about scientific letters of support, which I think are pretty much adjacent or related, strongly related to declarations. And I just want to give you a little bit of background as to how these 2 letters that I led came into being. So, unfortunately, my slides are not advancing. Oh, there we go. In August 2014, I read this article in The Conversation that came across my desk. I taught it in a number of my classes about how octopus farming would be the next big thing in aquaculture. It made the case that we should farm octopuses because they grow quickly, they have short lifespans, they would make lots of money for some people because they're highly valued, their meat is highly valued, and that the farming really had been stalled up until this point due to a number of technical reasons that had to do with life histories and some of the behavior of octopuses that they felt sure, these researchers felt sure they could overcome. And I remember thinking at the time that we should have a public conversation about this. And then I started digging in on YouTube as to what I could find or see, because I knew I would need to convince some colleagues to participate with me, because Jonathan kept mentioning expertise and or relevant expertise, and it's hard to say who has expertise in octopus farming because it doesn't really exist commercially, and it was being discussed as just an option. And so I started looking around at these tanks. I sent some of this imagery to Peter Godfrey Smith, who no doubt has relevant expertise because he studies octopuses in the wild as a philosopher of science. And we made, along with Becca Franks, who's a welfare scientist, and Walter Sanchez Suarez, who's also a welfare scientist and even more important in some ways from Spain, who was leading the charge on octopus farming, we made an argument and published an article that had three main elements to it. One is that the ecological impacts of octopus farming would be serious and unsustainable. That the animal impacts, of course, the impacts on the individuals would be serious and cruel, and that this activity would in no way contribute to food security. Yes, these animals are food. They're, in other words, consumed, but they are not necessary for livelihoods or survival of the markets in which they're sold. And we published this article, again, it takes years in academia to do almost anything, but in January 2019 in this magazine called Issues in Science and Technology. It's the popular arm of PNAS or the National Academy. And what I like about this journal, and I would want to promote them, is they're interested in publishing policy pieces that are not yet policy. And I'd say that's a really valuable space to know about and understand as a place where you could publish something like this. That same year, Compassion in World Farming and I had a call. They were thinking about launching a campaign against octopus farming, and indeed they did in October that year. But they said to me, we're thinking about going to some MPs in the EU and trying to convince them about a ban on octopus farming, which was sort of a dream for me because I had been talking to some city level legislators thinking about maybe a ban in New York City or something like that. And they were like, well, no, we really want to aim big in terms of Europe. And I said, well, what could I do to help? What would be useful? And they said, well, a scientific letter of support would be useful. That's something we could take to the MPs to demonstrate that there was relevant expertise that was concerned about this. And so there was this opportunity because Jennifer Mather had published a piece in Animal Sentience in 2019 to respond to that piece and include, basically make it a letter, which we did. And per Jonathan's point, who's trying to get to over 500, for me, 100 had always been the kind of trademark number in my mind. We got to 111 here. And it's a mishmash of academics, but really people who are in some way or another linked to ecology, biology, ethics, philosophy, law, in some cases sociology. And it was a really, I mean, some person that if you look down at number 24, Dan Dennett, signed this letter, which was really important to me personally. He does not normally engage with much in terms of animal ethics, although he certainly talks about animal consciousness. And so that was a win. Peter Singer, Jeff Sebo, of course, who Jonathan mentioned. Anyway, and many of our other esteemed panelists. And I just wanted to point out that this letter then, this article comes out in the New Yorker in 2021 on animal translation, and you can see that they're citing it here actually as more than 100 experts have signed a declaration urging the banning of octopus farming on the grounds that these sentient and sophisticated animals should not be kept in sterile and monotonous environments. So interesting to me that it gets framed as a declaration, although it was a letter. And I guess in some ways it was declaring a normative position on octopus farming. And then something happens that I think is just completely unpredictable and really wild, genuinely wild in the sense that it's the first glimpse or extended glimpse of wild octopus behavior that really many parts of the world get through the fact that many of us were experiencing lockdown and many of us had Netflix subscriptions. This film, My Octopus Teacher, where again, up until this point, we had seen or heard or had these snippets of octopuses in tanks and in aquaria doing incredible things. And all of that, in my estimation, pales in comparison to what we see this species, Octopus vulgaris, pull off in the wild. And this is also the same species that's being pushed into mass production. There's a sort of somewhat dishonest moment of that film, though, where he talks about going into the scientific literature to look at who Octopus vulgaris is. And if he did that, which I'm sure he did, he would have discovered that one of the primary interests in vulgaris is actually as a farmed commodity, which doesn't get touched on in the film. But nevertheless, I think the film gets used by many of us interested in advocating for this issue. Important report comes out that one of our panelists is a lead author on in November 2021 on the sentience of cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. And notably in the report, they say that good welfare would be impossible for octopuses in captivity in a farm setting. That same month, Nueva Pesca Nova launches a plan to build the world's first commercial octopus farm off of the Canary Islands. Compassion World Farming has been very actively opposing the farm as well as other groups. The farm is currently stalled due to environmental impact assessments, but there is still a push by Nueva Pesca Nova and their associates to get this factory completed. Then there was an amazing piece published in the LA Times about this octopus farm, although it's really a ranch because they collect young octopuses and grow them in captivity in Hawaii. And this farm, as a result of the reporting and some advocacy done by Compassion World Farming, gets shut down. And I think that was also a kind of important cultural moment. In 2023, Elizabeth May introduces a petition into Canada for a federal ban on octopus farming. And that same year, really incredible advocates, Amanda Fox, Josh Diamond, they introduce a small bill into HB 1153 into the Washington State Congress, and it becomes what is the first state ban on octopus farming, signed into law February of this year, and starts getting major national coverage. Then octopus farming gets banned in California after a big push, again, by similar advocates and definitely snowballs into a bigger movement. There's Amanda Fox, who helped with the Washington ban on the left here. And I just wanted to note here in the Assembly bill from California, and Jonathan should feel very good about this, one of the justifications provided here is that a November 2021 London School of Economics analysis of over 300 studies, they found that because octopuses are asocial, solitary, they can become aggressive toward each other when kept in confinement. So this is an explicit also use of the science in the legislation. I find it interesting that sort of this connection between these normative arguments, the laws that follow, and the science then that they cite to support them are all heavily intertwined. Okay, octopus farming has now been banned, or a bill to ban octopus farming has now been introduced also in Hawaii. There are discussions with Florida, Alaska, Connecticut, and other states. And then, dream beyond dream, Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, and whose wife is an oceanographer, by the way, and Lisa Murkowski, the Republican sponsor, got together to introduce federal legislation. And White House's office contacted me to ask if I would be interested in helping to write a letter of support, scientific support, in favor of this bill. They also had a separate letter of support from NGOs, but they wanted individual scientists and experts. And I said, yeah, sure, I would be really interested in helping. And, you know, maybe we could even publish it in Science, the journal. And Lori, I think it's interesting that you also used Science, AAAS, as a kind of venue. And I knew this might be possible because I had signed a letter in Science, led by a member of my PhD committee, on that the WTO should ban harmful fisheries subsidies, which was signed by over 300 people, published in Science in advance of the WTO meetings. So I knew it was possible that these big kind of scientific letters of support could be published in Science. Jonathan had his doubts about that, by the way, which he might be able to share after. He nevertheless signed, but I think his fingers were crossed the whole time. This letter gets published just a week or two after the bill gets introduced, and it's framed, of course, as support for the U.S. Octopus Act to keep octopuses wild. There was a pretty limited amount of time that I had, as well as enormous bureaucratic hurdles to publish in Science because everyone has to sign these forms, which gets very stressful for people. So we capped it at just sort of 100 people even. And then at the last minute, people were sort of threatening dropping out. And I said, please don't, because we're at exactly 100 and I can't add any new authors. And I really thought 100 was important. So here are all 100 signatories. You can see all of our panelists present on this list, as well as a whole bunch of new voices. And what I think is great about this, and Jonathan, you referenced this a little bit as well, and certainly Lori, this was true for your group, which was much smaller initially, is that it builds a community of people who also have interest in this subject. And so now we kind of have this list and we share information over it about octopus farming. And I think some of the people on this list, like Craig Callender, who's a philosopher and ethicist, teaches this issue now in his classes. And bringing that kind of, pretty low level commitment on their part, but a kind of, again, normative stance into their work, I think does change the conversation significantly. The other thing I'll just mention is, this is a local radio station in South Miami. They were covering another study that came out, many of you will have seen recently, on octopuses hunting. It was published in Science. It got a lot of press, and that they recruit other fish to help them hunt. And you can just see here at the bottom that our letter gets mentioned here, and this effort with 100 scientists signed a letter in August supporting the ban. It's a really interesting way too that again, new science that comes out has nothing to do with the normative arguments. The normative arguments can sort of piggyback on some of that work, and nothing to do with anything I did, just again, sort of probably knowledge of Miami and Google search engine. And so people will tie these things together in interesting ways. So that's all I have to share. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer. And that's really helpful. So I want to thank all of our panelists, because this Animal Law and Science project is designed to do exactly what all you wonderful people are doing, right? It's to sort of bring together in community and in conversation scientists across the scientific spectrum and legal advocates to work better together. And your work is such a wonderful example of all of that. So thank you. There are a couple of questions in the chat. So the first two were for Lori. The first one was, can you explain what substantive and procedural means that you had referenced in your presentation?
Well, what I meant by that is simply that we are not recommending any particular legal procedures be applied to cetaceans, that they're really about the core content or substance of what they're trying to accomplish. So we're not saying, well, this has to happen in this way. We're just, it's more of an aspirational list.
And that's actually a great lead into the second question, which is, have there been any efforts to get the UN to adopt a declaration like you suggested?
There's been no effort for the declaration for cetaceans, as far as I know. I think I would have known about it. There was a lot of talk about it, but that never happened. So.
Great, thanks. So then we have a question that's sort of for everybody. So each declaration we're discussing here has a different ask regarding our moral obligations towards sentient beings. Is it better to A, make a firm demand, for instance, non-maleficence, banning farming, negative rights, that might trigger political resistance, or B, a broader welfare risk ask that might have its impact blunted by the animal industry or humane washing? So I guess this is a strategic question. Anyone can respond.
I mean, I'll jump in here because I feel like my ask is the firmest in terms of actionable items. Like, we want to ban octopus farming, or we don't want to see octopus farming happen. And this links to the next question in the Q&A as well, because one of the pushbacks initially in that letter, because I come from a more natural science training, and my community that I relied on initially was largely ecologists. And I will say that those ecologists were very sensitive to a few issues. One is that they were very sensitive to, are you saying that we shouldn't fish for octopuses, that we shouldn't eat octopuses at all? And we were very explicit in our ask to, no, we're just talking about adding another species to mass production in terms of the farming. And it was clear that if we had asked to sort of not eat octopuses, that would have been a very different line, and we would have had very few signatories on the first letter. And that was sort of eye-opening to me. And the other thing that they were uncomfortable with was like, well, a lot of these things that we're saying are true of pigs as well, for instance, and we have mass production for pigs. So where does that put me morally on that conversation? And I had to sort of walk them through saying, this is about here and now. This is about what we do in the next decade. We have problems we're trying to undo and address for a lot of other species. This is a question about adding a new species into mass production. And so those were examples I feel like of both disagreement and pushback, as well as the kind of risk of making a firm demand, as you often have to justify and sort of define the boundaries maybe more rigorously than I think in Jonathan's presentation, he made the case of already trying to blur the boundaries a little bit to entice people to come in.
I think we're all engaged in trying to build broad coalitions in support of effective change. So that does involve a lot of pragmatic thinking about what sort of changes are feasible and what can we do that will actually be effective. Yeah, and of course, the issues Jamie's raising in his question is a very real one. Is it possible to go too far so the change you're asking for becomes so incremental and tiny that it's too far away from the end goal you want? A good case to think about in relation to this is the Better Chicken commitment, which is a huge campaigning goal of many animal welfare organizations, pretty much begging supermarkets really to stop using these incredibly low welfare, fast-growing breeds and to switch to more traditional breeds that suffer less. And the ask is so tiny there, and yet the resistance so great. Very interesting. Shows you, in a way, it's very revealing, I think, about the lengths the industry will go to sometimes to avoid the tiniest welfare improvement.
You know, it's really interesting because you find yourself thinking, well, if you ask for something big, you'll never get it. Like we just set it out in that declaration, and I don't think anybody thought that it was going to be adopted. But it's interesting to think about the issue of declarations. What purpose do they serve? If they are not legal documents and they don't drive policy, or maybe they do, how all of us have put a lot of work and effort into different documents and declarations of different types. What do you see as the way to give them teeth, if any way?
We weren't aiming for teeth in our case. For the New York one, it's not intended to have teeth. Of course, by contrast, the Animal Welfare Sentience Act that my report was shaping, this is intended to have teeth. I think in the next seminar, you'll discuss whether it's working or not.
Yeah.
Jennifer, did you want to? Yeah.
Well, yeah, a part of my other work has to do with climate obstruction in the meat and dairy industry and climate obstruction generally. And you can see the value in these declarations in the sense that the industry and PR firms who help them have their own set of declarations that come out. The Oregon petition was a famous one, denying the existence of anthropogenic climate change. But more recently, around the issue of meat and dairy and livestock, was the Dublin Declaration, which they also got published in a Nature journal, and had to do with livestock scientists from all over the world signing on to the essentiality of livestock in human diets. And so for me, it's always been very revealing when you go, will this matter? Does this matter? And if you see that industry is willing to fund these kind of opportunities as well, it suggests to me that it does matter. I think how it matters is unpredictable, and when it matters is sort of unpredictable, but it's clear that having this kind of record with a variety of signatures, you know, these numbers of signatures, these clearly matter to how these stories unfold. So so yeah, that's a roundabout maybe way of answering, Lori, your question, but I feel very certain that that people have their eye on this tool.
Be in it to win it, as they say. And in a way, the game here is shaping public opinion of the future. And we know there are very powerful forces pushing it in the direction of very problematic low welfare practices. And so you've got to be in there pushing the other way to have any chance of getting public opinion to change in the direction that it ought to.
Yeah, and I think all of your responses sort of indicate this is not a linear process, right? And it's really context specific. So I think it does matter what you're asking of an industry that's already established versus one that's maybe in its infancy, right? And so that context really matters, but it's iterative. And I think, Jennifer, your presentation really helped see like these other things come into play that we can't predict, like movies or what have you, that come to social consciousness. But other people begin relying on the work that you're doing in ways that you couldn't have predicted. And then that gives it more credibility. And then that gives you more work, you know, or more strength for the work that you are planning strategically yourself, right? And so I think it really is
we
very
didn't expect,
contextual.
we didn't expect to be influencing law in California when writing a report in the UK in 2021. So it's a good example.
It's a great example, right? And so the fact that your work, Jonathan, is cited in so many different places and in so many different ways, right? Just that the nature, honestly, I share it with my students to show the importance of science in legal decision making, right? And that it matters. So all of this work, I think, builds a foundation upon which we can have larger conversations. And that's really phenomenal.
May I ask a question of the panel, which is, I had a really hard time managing the signatures, sort of policing the boundaries of expertise. And some people would offer to help, for instance, find signatures. And that always made me uncomfortable because I was really trying to focus on, for instance, North American scholars with a university email address in the case of the Octopus Act. Where we extended that sometimes over the pond, Jonathan, to certain people, but yeah, I sort of wonder if you have good systems in place that I could learn from.
Oh, well, with the New York Declaration, the good system in place is Sophia Fogel at NYU, who did personally invested a huge amount of time in that whole project and did a really wonderful job. But seems to be committed to NYU. So it's like as long as your initiative is based at NYU, it will work brilliantly.
I have a question, but I want to make sure that there's time to take all of the Q&A questions. So, Kathy.
So we do have, a few. We only have about 4 minutes left. So let me just say those questions sort of quickly, and then I'll let you as panelists decide. So one was that generic question Jennifer more general question Jennifer had referenced about pushback. So if you want to see more about pushback, how you've experienced it and what grounds it comes on. Another one is sort of the distinction between species. Again, that has already been referenced a little bit. And so the specific question here is we might more realistically aim to abolish active cruelty like deep sea fishing. But again, the special concern for some animals and not others. And the last question is any consideration about international waters about adopting welfare policies and declarations. So those are the questions. I'll leave it to the panelists to decide.
So on the question about pushback, expected more actually to the New York Declaration, because in my mind it's going pretty firmly against a lot of behaviorist influenced received wisdom in the sciences. And in fact, the reception was very, very positive on the whole, including NBC, BBC, like I mentioned. And that was great. And it made us think we timed it well to get a good audience that understood what we were trying to do. Nonetheless, I mean, there is pushback. Yeah, there is pushback, but the balance of it relative to praise was not what I expected at all. So I was pleasantly surprised.
I'll jump in on the species of special concern. This was, of course, an issue with the octopus farming, because you could argue there's a lot of wolf eels, you know, are being slated for mass production or other kinds of fish. The issue is that octopus were, there was a sense that they were having a moment culturally. And then there was also, and so people would be sort of familiar with the argument. They wouldn't have to educate them about what a wolf eel was. They would sort of know. And then I also feel like with this issue, it's so new. It's about, there is no octopus farming lobby, really. There might be a little one in Spain, but in the US, for instance. And I think this gets to the next question too, is that the US bills, both state and federal, are not only about production of octopus farming, but also imports. And so that also affects that they would not be buying farmed octopus from Nueva Pesca Nova, for instance. And that is a way, of course, to address any international issue, is that you have in your legislation something about imports, that you hold. It's always been a major gap in our legislation that we don't hold imports to the same standards, for instance, with fish in general, that we demand that our own fish are caught in US waters. And so that is a consideration. I think for us with octopus farming, we thought if this could succeed, it actually would be a way to give people a heuristic to how to think about introducing new farmed animals at all moving forward. That it would be a kind of line in the sand, that right now we're in this massive revolution with regard to aquaculture. We're adding more and more new species every year, and that maybe this could help be one of the exercises to draw a boundary around that.
Yeah, I like that. Certainly, I think that, you know, getting international sign-on for cetaceans is going to be a very tall order. And because there's so much heterogeneity around the world in terms of how different cultures and natures perceive and treat dolphins and whales. So that is a short answer, but it can be difficult.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to the end of our time. I could keep chatting with all of you for a long time, and I'm sure there are other questions that we have for one another, but we'll continue this conversation in a slightly different version next month. So I've just put the link in the chat for folks if you want to attend that session. I want to thank Jennifer, Lori, and Jonathan for this wonderful conversation and for the work that you're doing, and thank everybody for attending. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.